If you've spent much time online looking at right-wing content, you will have no doubt come across the Frankfurt School before. Who are the Frankfurt School? Well, that depends on who you ask. If you ask a leftist, they may say that they're a bunch of extremely bright intellectuals of the early 20th century that were looking to liberate human beings from the oppressive structures of Western culture. However, if you ask someone on the right, you'd probably hear something like the Frankfurt School are a shadowy grouping of German Jewish intellectuals with a stated aim to corrupt the West. Now, there is some truth to that. There's no doubt that the Frankfurt School did seek to undermine Western tradition, as well as our aesthetic and sexual norms. That's why many people today blame them for wokeness. I think that's a bit oversimplified. I always think the British School of Cultural Studies under Stuart Hall in the latter part of the 20th century gets away with a lot there. But then you could say that the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies could trace its genealogy back to the Frankfurt School and the thinkers that came after it. So you might think it's odd then that someone who's quite a prominent figure on the online right recently said he was quite impressed by Adorno, Horkheimer and Marcuse. They are core Frankfurt School thinkers. Now, this quote from Carl Benjamin of Lotus Eaters fame caused quite a stir online. You could see that some people on the right thought it was almost a form of betrayal, whereas some people in the classical liberal centre thought that this was more evidence of the quote-unquote woke right. The woke right is what liberals call right-wingers who have criticisms of liberalism. They're essentially saying they're the same as woke leftists, just on the other side. Now, I made a video about that before. I'll link it down below if you want to check it out. I think it's a bit of a nonsense term just for liberals to feel like they're big-brained, sensible, rational centrists and everyone else is an idiot. Further to that, I don't think the whole woke right theory really stands up to scrutiny. It's a bit silly, really. But anyway, that's not the point of this video. What I want to talk about is Marcuse, Adorno and Horkheimer, three core figures of the Frankfurt School, and whether we can actually learn anything from them. It's easy to just dismiss them as sort of these evil people who corrupted Western tradition. But I do think, having read them myself at university, there is something in there. I get what Carl is talking to, and it's important to be aware of it. So who were the Frankfurt School and what did they think about the world? Well, as I said earlier, they were predominantly German Jewish and they fled Germany after Hitler came to power. They went to America. Now, they were trained in a background of Marxism. However, they noticed in the Soviet Union that Marxism wasn't exactly going to plan. So they changed their tack a bit and decided instead of focusing on economics, they would focus on culture as the core method of oppression. You could say that the Frankfurt School were the original cultural Marxists. That phrase isn't too popular these days, but it's essentially what they did. They took Marxist theory and applied it to culture, but they also took on board a lot of the ideas of Sigmund Freud. This is important because it meant they viewed the world through the prism of the unconscious, specifically with regards to the individual and society at large. Now, as I said earlier, they were doing this because supposedly it would lead to the liberation of man from the oppressive structures of the West. That includes capitalism and Western culture itself. Of course, there's a big question as to whether those things really are oppressive, but for the sake of the video, let's just go with it for now. Now, it would be too difficult to explore every single Frankfurt School thinker. There's a lot of them. So as I say, I'm going to focus down on Adorno and Horkheimer, who normally come together. They did a lot of work together, and Marcuse. A good place to start is Adorno and Horkheimer's book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. In said book, they argue that the Enlightenment that took place in Europe, which was supposed to bring humanity into an age of reason, has backfired. They believe it created fascism and the cultural industry, which maintains a form of hyper-capitalism. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that the hyper-focus on rationalism led to something they called instrumental reason. That's a form of control. They believed that this rational society led to a control of broader human values. It made human beings more like robots. It also meant everything became about being efficient and practical rather than paying heed to the deeper dimensions of life, and also divorcing man from nature. Now, given that Adorno and Horkheimer are taking aim at the Enlightenment, tells you that they're going straight for the liberal tradition. And therefore, some of these arguments I'm very sympathetic towards. As a traditionalist myself, I agree that liberal capitalist modernity can make people more robotic. It does give us a cultural production which doesn't really serve us and often corrupts us from the inside. Adorno and Horkheimer believed that the standardized, mass-produced culture industry created a manipulated mass of people who were pushed into a form of bovine passivity or false consciousness, to use Marxian language, thinking they need products they don't, not really understanding the reality in front of them. Again, I'd say that's a valid critique of liberalism. After all, we all know who Kim Kardashian is, and why do any of us really care what she has for lunch or what rapper she's dating this week? All she really is an attractive woman who's got lots of implants, but the culture industry makes people care about her by constantly creating fake drama and making her seem important. The Frankfurt School might look to someone like Freud here and play on some form of desire, maybe sexual or otherwise, to make you think that someone like Kim Kardashian really matters. Now again, as a traditionalist, I would have similar criticisms towards liberalism. That's where the woke right thing comes from, the big brain classical liberals thing, because similar arguments are being made with regards to how power functions from the left and the right. They're the same people. So while there's some crossover with regards to criticisms of liberalism, in reality there are massive differences between a traditional worldview and that of the Frankfurt School, and that comes down to the classic thing with the left wing, which is, where is all of this going? What's it all for? Like most leftists, in a word, what the Frankfurt School are aiming at is quote-unquote liberation. However, that is, as usual, very vague and tends to cause a lot more trouble than it's worth in the long run. Case in point, has there been anything over the last decade that's been more pernicious than woke ideology in all of our culture and our academic institutions? This is a common feature with the left. We saw it a lot with Marxism. You can call your nation a people's republic all you like, but they don't serve the people at all and end up in complete tyranny most of the time. Also, if we go back to our instrumental reason list from Adorno and Horkheimer, you can see that wokeism essentially does this too. It has control over human values, does it not? Humans are becoming robotic. All the young people seem to have the same point of views while thinking that they are individualistic. Another very important criticism of the worldview of the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School is around this idea that the capitalist system, the liberal system, creates false needs that only mass consumer capitalism can solve. Well, that implies that if you figure that out, that there's some form of liberation out there. Now, as I've already said, that liberation is very vaguely defined and tends to lead to more of a dystopia. But the important thing here is to recognize that they're essentially making a religious argument. Critical theory is a pseudo-religion. Marxism, critical theory, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, is a religion for atheists. People who believe you can create heaven on earth. Now, whenever they've tried to create that heaven on earth, all they've really done is open the gates of hell on humanity. To my mind, that's why our tradition is correct in this regard. It knows that on this side of heaven, we're in a fallen state. We are not going to find perfect justice on earth. That can only be found in the spirit, the core of our tradition, if you will. This means, from the traditionalist perspective, every person has hope, yet in day-to-day reality in our lives, we can also accept that inequality is part of life, hierarchy is part of life, and it's natural. Yet the leftist dream has always been to counteract that, to state that we can find this mad equality across the board somehow. And this leads to one of the most famous elements of the Frankfurt School, and that's a celebration of ugliness. As you might imagine, Adorno and Horkheimer viewed Western art, and especially Western conceptions of beauty, as another way for the elite to maintain its power balance. This is why much of our modern art is so ugly today. It's at least in part because the Frankfurt School pushed forward the idea that ugliness was a way of undermining Western power structures. The following quotes are from Pamela Leach on Adorno's aesthetics of the ugly. She states, disparaging the seductiveness of classical beauty, modern art depicts human alienation and indexed contemporary society. She continues, the ugly, deployed as a technique of resistance, has afforded modern art the potential to articulate political truths. It has raised an ethical consciousness of objective needs repressed by the administered society. And now is a good time to bring in Herbert Marcuse. He carried on this idea of art as a revolutionary force, especially art that was somehow transfigured in sort of protest against Western tradition. However, Marcuse took this one step further into the realm of sexual norms as well. He believed the Western tradition maintained its power through sexual normativity. Thereby, he was an early proponent of the female liberation movements and LGBTQ ideology. Marcuse's most famous work is probably One Dimensional Man. In the book, he argues that mass consumer culture is a form of political control, that people are essentially mindless robots who can't make decisions for themselves. They can't even really think for themselves. So they have to be told what to do and buy by the mainstream culture and adverts and so on. And you might ask, well, where's all this heading towards? And for Marcuse, it's an idea of the individual being completely freed from the quote-unquote constraints of the Western world to be completely himself. The downside of this, however, is it does tend to lead to quite narcissistic individuals. This sort of egocentrism in the name of rebellion is what you're seeing on your screen right now. These are Just Stop Oil protesters throwing soup over Vincent van Gogh's painting Sunflowers. Now, why are they doing that to a Van Gogh piece? Why are they in the museum they are in? Whether knowingly or not, they have been influenced by the Frankfurt School. They are purposefully going for the Western canon, traditional Western art. They're not throwing this over modern art. Now, these young brats have convinced themselves they're saving the world, I'm sure, but what we're witnessing here is the problem with both critical theory and liberalism itself, and that's that it does focus on this rampant individualism, which is quite corrosive in the long run. It's also quite chaotic in the long run. Now, to be fair, I've barely scratched the surface when it comes to the Frankfurt School. There's a lot more in there yet, but the point I'm trying to get across here is how they can make some valid critiques of liberalism and even some of capitalism might be sympathetic to. It's just, where is it all going? It seems to point towards this utopia, which is going to turn into a dystopia pretty quickly. Case in point as to why these leftist ideas rarely work in reality. At one time in the late 60s, there was a student uprising at a university Adorno was teaching at, and apparently instead of joining the left-wing protesters who all very much looked up to him, he locked his office door and rang the police on them. All of a sudden, power structures like the police weren't so toxic after all. But the most important point to make here is that critical theory, like liberalism, undermines our tradition. It's a hard one to get your head around in this day and age, but our tradition isn't just an idea. It's not just a set of philosophies competing with others. It's much deeper than that. It's a way of life. It's a practice. It's spiritual. It's religious. It's cultural. It's ethnic. So in closing, I hope it can make sense why someone on the right can read Marcuse, Adorno and Horkheimer and find them impressive. And I also hope a little exploration into the Frankfurt School shows us the core problem that we have at the moment in the West, and that's our spiritual state. It's where we're aligned. But this reawakening to our tradition and its spiritual, philosophical and political dimensions is something I want to speak more about in 2025. If you want me to do more of these sorts of videos, looking through any other leftist thinkers, do let me know in the comments down below. I had to read a lot of them at uni, so it's quite interesting going back and jogging my memory. Anyway, do let me know what you think down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.